The dusty plains near Montgisard shimmered under the afternoon sun on November 25th, 1177. A teenage boy sat on horseback, his face hidden behind a silver mask that concealed the ravages of leprosy. King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem, just 16 years old, surveyed an impossible situation. Sultan Saladin was advancing with 26,000 soldiers, cavalry, infantry, siege equipment, expecting to crush the weak Crusader kingdom and march unopposed into Jerusalem. Against this overwhelming invasion, Baldwin could muster barely 500 knights. Every military calculation screamed retreat. Every advisor urged him to hide behind Jerusalem's walls. Instead, Baldwin made a decision that would become legend. He would attack, and before leading that suicidal charge, he would remove his mask and show his diseased face to his men. Before we continue, let me correct a common historical misconception. The title of this video mentions 500 lepers charging Saladin's army. That's dramatic, but it's not accurate. Baldwin IV suffered from leprosy, yes, but those 500 knights who followed him, they were perfectly healthy elite warriors, Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, the most professional, best-trained heavy cavalry in medieval Christendom. The confusion comes from medieval propaganda and legend that sometimes exaggerated the story into an army of sick men defeating a healthy empire. The truth is more inspiring. 500 healthy professional warriors chose to follow a dying teenage leper king into impossible battle because his courage inspired them. To understand why this moment was extraordinary, you need to grasp what leprosy meant in 1177. Medieval society considered it God's curse, divine punishment for sin. Lepers were required by law to wear bells, warning of their approach, forbidden from touching healthy people, exiled to isolated colonies. Kings diagnosed with leprosy were expected to abdicate immediately, no exceptions. The disease was progressive and fatal, destroying the body piece by piece. Loss of sensation, then tissue damage, then disfigurement, then blindness, then death. There was no cure, no hope, only inevitable deterioration. Baldwin had been diagnosed at age 9 when his tutor noticed the boy couldn't feel pain in his right arm. For 7 years, he'd watched his body slowly betray him. By 16, his hands were becoming claws, his face was partially destroyed, requiring the silver mask, and everyone knew he had maybe 5 or 10 years left to live. Most teenagers would have surrendered to despair. Instead, Baldwin studied military tactics, learned to command armies, and prepared to be the king his doomed kingdom needed. The Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177 was a fragile Crusader state barely 80 years old, a Christian island surrounded by Muslim powers determined to reclaim the Holy Land. Baldwin had inherited the throne at 13 when his father died. His regency council assumed he'd be a figurehead, too sick to rule effectively. They were catastrophically wrong. Despite his disease, Baldwin possessed a brilliant military mind, absolute fearlessness born from having nothing to lose, and the ability to inspire fierce loyalty in warriors who should have been disgusted by his affliction. Saladin, 39 years old and at the height of his powers, had spent 1177 consolidating control over Egypt and Syria. He'd assembled 26,000 soldiers to invade the Crusader kingdom, believing Jerusalem was vulnerable. His intelligence report said Baldwin was dying, possibly bedridden, with Crusader forces scattered defending other territories. Saladin expected token resistance at best. He divided his massive army into foraging columns to feed his troops from the countryside, standard practice when facing weak opposition. It would prove a fatal miscalculation. This story reaches you in English, the language connecting Crusader history from the Knights' Halls of England to the War Museums of Australia, from American military academies to Canadian heritage sites, from New Zealand's historical societies to medieval studies across the Commonwealth. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you watching? The Crusades shaped Western military tradition, influenced centuries of culture, and their echoes still resonate today. That's why Baldwin's story matters. It's about courage transcending physical limitation. Baldwin's opportunity came from Saladin's overconfidence. Crusader scouts reported the Muslim army was scattered across miles of territory, different units foraging separately, command structure dispersed. Saladin himself was with only a portion of his forces. If Baldwin struck immediately with his 500 elite knights before Saladin could concentrate that scattered army, The numerical disadvantage might not matter. 500 knights in full armor charging into unprepared, dispersed light cavalry could cause catastrophic chaos before numbers overwhelmed them. Those 500 knights were no ordinary soldiers. They were Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, military religious orders who'd taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, dedicating their lives to defending the Holy Land. These men had trained for years in heavy cavalry warfare. Each wore 60 pounds of chainmail and plate armor, rode war horses bred for size and strength, and fought with lance, sword, and mace. They were medieval tanks, nearly unstoppable in close combat. They weren't sick. They weren't dying. They were professional warriors at the peak of their abilities, but they needed a leader worth following into suicide. Baldwin gathered his 500 knights and revealed his plan. Attack Saladin's dispersed forces immediately before the enemy could concentrate. But first, he needed them to follow a leper king. So Baldwin did something extraordinary. He removed his silver mask, revealing his disease-ravaged face. Then he spoke words recorded by chroniclers. "I will not ask you to go where I will not lead." The knights knelt. They would follow. But what made this charge legendary wasn't that the knights were sick. It was that their dying teenage king refused to let disease stop him from leading them. On the Crusader side stood Baldwin IV, 16 years old, dying of leprosy, and refusing to accept either fate. Diagnosed at age 9, he'd spent 7 years watching his body progressively fail. The disease had started in his right arm with a loss of sensation, then spread to his hands, then his face. By 16, his fingers were contracting into claws, his facial features were partially destroyed, and he wore a silver mask to hide the disfigurement from a society that saw leprosy as divine curse. Medieval medicine offered no cure, no treatment, only inevitable progression to blindness, total disfigurement, and death. Most boys would have hidden away. Baldwin studied warfare, learned to command with one functional hand, and prepared to die gloriously rather than waste away. Despite his disease, Baldwin possessed extraordinary qualities that made him exceptional leader. He was highly intelligent, multilingual, and understood complex military strategy. He was fearless in combat, knowing he was already dead on borrowed time. Most importantly, he inspired absolute loyalty. Knights who should have been repulsed by his leprosy instead followed him into impossible battles. There's something compelling about a leader who knows death is certain and chooses to die fighting. Baldwin's courage made healthy warriors question their own fears. Now let's be absolutely clear about those 500 knights who followed Baldwin. They were not lepers. They were not sick. They were the military elite of medieval Christendom, Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, professional soldiers who dedicated their lives to warfare. The Templars wore distinctive white surcoats with red crosses. The Hospitallers wore black surcoats with white crosses. Both orders recruited from nobility, trained warriors from youth, and maintained discipline that regular armies couldn't match. These 500 men represented years of military training, religious dedication, and combat experience. They were perfectly healthy, perfectly trained, and perfectly deadly. The historical confusion about leper armies comes from medieval propaganda and legend that grew around Montgisard. Some chroniclers, wanting to emphasize the miraculous nature of the victory, exaggerated the story to suggest Baldwin's entire army was afflicted. Others misunderstood that while Baldwin had leprosy, his knights did not. The myth of 500 sick men defeating 26,000 healthy soldiers is dramatic but false. The truth is more inspiring. 500 elite professional warriors followed a dying teenage king because his courage transcended his disease. If this story of the teenage leper king who refused to surrender, who led Christianity's finest warriors into impossible battle and emerged victorious, is gripping you right now, you need to subscribe to Unfinished Battles and smash that like button. Because what happens in the next few hours at Montgisard isn't just military history, it's a masterclass in leadership, courage, and tactical brilliance. This is about refusing to let physical limitations define what's possible. Stay with us. Facing Baldwin was Saladin, Salahaddin Yusuf ibn Ayyub, 39 years old and the most formidable Muslim commander of the era. Born in Tikrit, trained in military service, risen to Sultan of Egypt and Syria, Saladin had spent years uniting fractious Muslim kingdoms to present united front against Crusaders. He was brilliant strategist, charismatic leader, and genuinely pious Muslim who saw reconquering Jerusalem as religious duty. His reputation for chivalry was renowned even among Crusaders. But in November 1177, his greatest weakness showed: overconfidence born from underestimating a sick teenage enemy. Saladin commanded approximately 26,000 soldiers assembled from Egypt and Syria. His core strength was light cavalry, fast mobile horse archers who could harass enemies from distance. He had thousands of infantry, both regular soldiers and religious volunteers. He had siege equipment for attacking Jerusalem's walls. Most importantly, he had overwhelming numerical superiority and knew it. His intelligence suggested Baldwin was dying, possibly bedridden, with Jerusalem defended by skeleton garrison. Saladin expected this campaign to be glorified raid, not serious battle. The forces facing each other were dramatically mismatched in numbers, but not in quality. Baldwin's 500 knights were outnumbered 52-1, but they were heavy cavalry, medieval equivalent of tanks. Each knight in full armor on a warhorse was nearly invincible in close combat. Templar and Hospitaller training emphasized discipline, coordination, and shock tactics. They'd spent years preparing for exactly this, charging into larger enemy forces and breaking them through sheer armored momentum. Against scattered, unprepared light cavalry, 500 heavy cavalry could accomplish what 5,000 couldn't in normal battle. The strategic situation was desperate. If Saladin reached Jerusalem, the city would fall. The Crusader kingdom's survival depended on stopping him before he besieged the capital. But Baldwin couldn't defend Jerusalem's walls and wait. Saladin could besiege the city while raiding the countryside. Baldwin needed decisive victory, needed to shatter Saladin's army so completely he'd retreat to Egypt. With 500 against 26,000, that seemed impossible, unless Saladin made mistake. And Saladin was making catastrophic mistake. His army was scattered, foraging separately, vulnerable to sudden attack. As afternoon approached on November 25th, Baldwin made his decision. Before the charge, he removed his silver mask, revealing his disease-ravaged face to his knights. It was a profound gesture, showing them the face he normally hid, refusing to lead from behind symbol of shame. The 500 Templars and Hospitallers, healthy elite warriors all, saw their dying king's courage and pledged to follow him. Not because they were sick like him, but because his courage inspired them to be worthy of his leadership. Late afternoon on November 25th brought the decisive moment. Baldwin's scouts returned with crucial intelligence. Saladin's army was scattered across several miles, different units foraging in separate areas, the Sultan himself with only a portion of his forces near Tel Gezer. The Muslim army wasn't concentrated mass ready for battle. They were dispersed groups thinking themselves safe from weak enemy. Baldwin saw his opportunity. If he attacked immediately, before Saladin could gather his scattered forces, 500 heavy cavalry might accomplish what no larger army could. It was now or never. Baldwin gave the order. 500 knights formed up in disciplined ranks. These weren't chaotic medieval charges from movies. They were precisely organized military formations, perfected through years of Templar and Hospitaller training. Knights arranged in wedge shapes designed to punch through enemy lines, each man knowing his position, his role, his sacred duty. Templars in their white surcoats with red crosses, Hospitallers in black with white crosses, all united under Baldwin's command. The boy king, masked again after his revelation, rode at the front where kings were supposed to be. Before the charge, prayers were offered before the true cross, Christianity's most sacred relic supposedly containing wood from Christ's crucifixion. The Bishop of Bethlehem carried the relic at the formation's front, its golden case gleaming in the afternoon sun. Baldwin and his 500 knights knelt, asking God's blessing for the impossible task ahead. They prayed to Saint George, patron saint of soldiers. Medieval warriors were deeply religious, believing divine intervention determined battles. These 500 healthy professional warriors needed to believe God was with them and their dying king because military logic certainly wasn't. Then they mounted their war horses and prepared to charge. The approach was crucial. Baldwin needed to reach Saladin's forces before they could organize defense. Heavy cavalry's advantage was shock impact, the devastating moment when armored knights on armored horses crashed into enemy formations at full gallop. But that advantage disappeared if enemy had time to form proper defensive positions with spears and concentrated archers. So Baldwin's knights approached at steady trot, preserving horses' energy, staying in perfect formation, waiting until they were close enough that acceleration to full charge would hit before defenders could prepare. Saladin's forces, scattered and foraging, had no warning. The first Muslim soldiers to see the Crusader charge probably didn't believe it. The enemy army they'd been told was weak and cowering was attacking? Impossible. Must be small raiding party. By the time they realized that this was 500 of Christianity's finest warriors committed to full assault, it was too late to organize effective defense. Knights in full armor on war horses weigh over a ton combined. At full gallop, they're unstoppable. The first Muslim cavalry unit to receive the charge simply disintegrated. The impact was catastrophic. Crusader lances, 12-foot weapons designed for shock combat, punched through light cavalry armor like parchment. Muslim horses, smaller and lighter than European war horses, were bowled over by the charge's sheer mass and momentum. Knights who'd broken lances immediately drew swords and maces, cutting down anyone within reach. The key was maintaining momentum. If cavalry stopped moving in enemy midst, they could be surrounded and pulled down. So Templar sergeants screamed at knights to keep moving, keep killing, drive deeper into enemy positions. These 500 weren't sick men fighting despite weakness. They were professional warriors at peak physical condition executing tactics they'd trained for their entire adult lives. Each Templar and Hospitaller had spent years learning to fight in heavy armor, coordinate with fellow knights, maintain formation under pressure, and exploit heavy cavalry's overwhelming advantages. This was their purpose, their calling, their entire reason for existence. And they were devastating. Saladin's light cavalry, excellent for harassment and mounted archery, was helpless against heavy cavalry charge. Their tactics required distance and mobility. Shoot arrows, retreat, shoot again, wear enemies down over time. But Crusader knights closed distance before those tactics could work. In close combat, an armored knight with a lance and sword massacred a lightly armored horse archer with bow. The disparity was shocking. Medieval chroniclers describe individual knights cutting through 5 or 6 Muslim soldiers, each in the initial charge before their weapons even broke. The psychological impact exceeded physical casualties. Muslim soldiers throughout the scattered army heard sounds of combat, saw dust clouds, received garbled reports of Crusader attack. Panic spread faster than facts. How many Crusaders were attacking? Thousands? The entire kingdom's army? In chaos and confusion, Saladin's numerical advantage meant nothing because those numbers couldn't coordinate. Units that could have rallied instead fled, fearing they'd be cut off and destroyed individually by the armored juggernauts crushing their comrades. By the time Saladin received word of the attack, the situation was already chaos. Different commanders sent contradictory reports. Some units were fighting, some retreating, some had no idea what was happening. Saladin tried to rally his bodyguard and counterattack, but he couldn't locate most of his scattered army. The 500 healthy elite warriors led by their dying teenage king were systematically destroying an army 50 times their size, and Saladin was helpless to stop it. What began as coordinated charge became systematic destruction of panicking army. Saladin's scattered forces, unable to concentrate under surprise attack, started breaking and fleeing individually. Units that hadn't even been engaged heard rumors of massive Crusader assault and ran without fighting. The psychological collapse was total. Muslim soldiers who'd marched confidently toward Jerusalem that morning were now fleeing desperately toward Egypt, abandoning equipment, horses, and wounded comrades. The 26,000-strong army that was supposed to conquer the Crusader kingdom was disintegrating into terrified mob. The pursuit was relentless and methodical. Medieval cavalry doctrine taught that most battle casualties occurred during pursuit, not during initial fighting. Once an army broke and ran, cavalry could ride down fleeing soldiers who couldn't defend themselves effectively. The 500 Templars and Hospitallers, motivated by religious fervor and the thrill of impossible victory, chased scattered Muslim forces for miles across the Montgisard plains. These weren't sick men fighting through weakness. They were elite professionals executing their training with brutal efficiency. Each knight's warhorse could easily run down lighter Muslim cavalry horses bred for endurance rather than speed. Each armored crusader was effectively invulnerable to panicked soldiers' desperate attacks. A fleeing man turning to fight with sword couldn't penetrate 60 pounds of chainmail and plate armor. Arrows fired in panic from retreating archers bounced off steel. The killing went on for hours, the 500 cutting through thousands like armored wolves among sheep. Chronicles describe scenes of apocalyptic slaughter across the plains. Muslim soldiers throwing away weapons to run faster, making themselves defenseless. Cavalry trampling infantry who couldn't keep pace with mounted retreat. Men drowning trying to cross streams in panicked flight. Units that tried to rally being scattered by renewed Crusader charges. The flat terrain around Montgisard, which should have been perfect for Saladin's numerical advantage, became killing ground where Crusader heavy cavalry hunted scattered enemies with complete impunity. Saladin himself was in mortal danger. With only his personal bodyguard and a few hundred loyal troops, he found himself surrounded by fleeing soldiers and pursuing Crusaders. Baldwin's knights were cutting through scattered Muslim forces actively hunting for the Sultan. If Saladin was killed or captured, the war would effectively end. Muslim unity would collapse without his leadership. Everything he'd built, the alliance between Egypt and Syria, the coalition against the Crusaders, depended on his survival. And that survival was suddenly very much in question. Saladin's escape was narrow and deeply humiliating. His bodyguard fought desperately to buy him time, many dying to protect their sultan. Saladin was forced to abandon his warhorse and mount a racing camel, faster for long-distance escape, but profoundly humiliating for warrior of his status. The Sultan who'd ridden into the kingdom of Jerusalem expecting easy conquest was now fleeing for his life on a camel, his carefully assembled army destroyed around him. Chronicles say he reached Egypt with only a fraction of his forces, exhausted, traumatized, and humiliated beyond measure. The casualty figures were staggering. Contemporary estimates claimed 20,000 to 23,000 Muslim casualties, killed, captured, or permanently scattered. Modern historians think these numbers somewhat inflated, but agree losses exceeded 15,000 dead and wounded, with thousands more captured or lost to desertion. Crusader casualties were minimal. Medieval sources suggest fewer than 50 killed and perhaps 100 wounded. The disparity reflected the one-sided nature of the battle. Professional armored cavalry massacring fleeing light infantry and cavalry who couldn't effectively fight back. The battlefield after Montgisard was carpeted with Muslim dead. Crusader soldiers spent following days looting bodies, collecting weapons and armor, gathering prisoners for ransom. The amount of captured equipment was so vast it took weeks to transport to Jerusalem. Saladin's siege equipment, supply train, and treasure chest were all captured intact. The invasion force that was supposed to conquer Jerusalem had itself been utterly conquered. By nightfall on November 25th, Baldwin and his 500 knights returned to Jerusalem as heroes. The teenage leper king who'd removed his mask and led suicidal charge had destroyed an army 50 times larger than his own. The dying boy who should have been hiding in palace had saved the kingdom. Priests proclaimed it miracle, divine intervention proving God favored the Crusaders. The 500 healthy knights who'd charged with Baldwin knew they'd witnessed something extraordinary. Military victory that defied all probability. The True Cross relic was returned to Jerusalem in triumph. Medieval Crusaders attributed the victory to the cross's presence, believing it had channeled divine power into their charge. Whether literal miracle or simply the psychological boost of fighting under Christianity's most sacred symbol, the True Cross became central to Montgisard's legend. But the military reality was simpler. 500 elite professional warriors led by inspiring commander had exploited enemy overconfidence and tactical dispersion. It wasn't sick men healed by miracle. It was healthy warriors inspired by dying king's courage to execute perfect cavalry tactics against a vulnerable enemy. The immediate aftermath of Montgisard was the Crusader kingdom's salvation. Saladin's invasion was shattered, his army destroyed, his reputation damaged. Jerusalem, which had been hours away from siege, was safe. The kingdom of Jerusalem, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, had won a reprieve. And at the center of this miracle stood Baldwin IV, the teenage leper king who'd removed his mask and led 500 elite warriors to victory against 26,000. His legend was born that day, though history would sometimes misremember exactly how. Here's where we need to address the historical confusion directly. Over the centuries, the legend of Montgisard became exaggerated. Some medieval chroniclers, wanting to emphasize the miraculous nature of the victory, began suggesting that Baldwin's entire army was afflicted with disease. The story transformed from leper king leads healthy warriors to army of lepers defeats healthy enemies. It's dramatic, it emphasizes divine intervention, but it's not true. Those 500 Templars and Hospitallers were perfectly healthy professional soldiers. The miracle wasn't that sick men were healed to fight. The miracle was that healthy elite warriors were inspired by their dying king's courage to achieve the impossible. Baldwin's actual achievement was far more inspiring than the myth. He didn't lead an army of fellow sufferers. He led professional warriors who had every reason to be disgusted by his disease, but instead chose to follow him into suicide because his courage transcended his physical condition. Medieval society told them lepers were cursed by God, untouchable, shameful. Baldwin showed them that courage and leadership had nothing to do with physical health. That's the real miracle. Not divine healing, but human inspiration overcoming social prejudice. Baldwin's personal story after Montgisard was bittersweet. He'd saved his kingdom, but his body continued its inevitable deterioration. Leprosy is progressive and incurable. After Montgisard, Baldwin lived 8 more years, each year bringing more suffering. His hands became useless claws as tendons contracted. His facial features continued eroding behind the permanent mask. He lost his sight. By his early 20s, he could no longer ride horses, hold weapons, or even walk unassisted. The warrior king who'd led cavalry charges was reduced to being carried on a litter, his commands given through intermediaries. Yet Baldwin continued ruling with the same courage he'd shown at Montgisard. Unable to fight physically, he fought politically and strategically. He managed fractious Crusader nobility, negotiated with Byzantium, organized kingdom defenses, and planned military campaigns he could no longer lead personally. He appointed competent commanders, including the legendary Reynald of Châtillon and Guy of Lusignan, and trusted them to execute his strategies. Until his death in 1185 at age 24, Baldwin remained the mind behind Crusader resistance, even as his body became prison. Montgisard bought the Crusader kingdom approximately 10 years. Saladin needed that decade to rebuild his shattered army, consolidate power, and prepare for another invasion. Those 10 years allowed Jerusalem to fortify defenses and prepare for inevitable return. Without Montgisard's reprieve, the kingdom might have fallen in 1177. Instead, it survived until 1187, 2 years after Baldwin's death. When Saladin finally returned with rebuilt army, Baldwin was gone. The Battle of Hattin in July 1187 was Montgisard's reverse. Saladin destroyed the Crusader field army and captured Jerusalem 3 months later. The true cross relic that had led Baldwin's charge at Montgisard was captured at Hattin, never to be recovered. The kingdom that Baldwin had saved barely lasted beyond his death. Without the leper king's leadership, internal conflicts and weak succession doomed it. The tactical lessons of Montgisard remain relevant. Heavy cavalry's shock value when properly deployed, the critical importance of attacking overconfident enemies before they can concentrate, the psychological impact of unexpected aggression, the vulnerability of dispersed forces. All these principles are still taught in military academies. Baldwin's decision to attack with 500 against 26,000 seems suicidal until you understand he attacked scattered forces with elite troops, not a concentrated army with random soldiers. The cultural impact extended beyond military history. Baldwin IV became legendary figure representing courage transcending physical limitation. A dying teenager who refused to surrender, who led from the front despite disease that should have hidden him away, who saved kingdom through sheer willpower and tactical brilliance. The myth of the leper army is less inspiring than the truth. Elite professional warriors following a dying boy because his courage made them want to be worthy of him. For modern audiences, Montgisard offers profound lesson. Baldwin didn't let disease define what was possible. He couldn't control his body's deterioration, but he could control his courage, his decisions, his leadership. The 500 healthy warriors who followed him weren't pitying a sick boy. They were following a leader whose spirit was stronger than his failing flesh. That's why Montgisard matters. It proves that physical limitation doesn't determine what you can achieve. If this story of the teenage leper king who refused to let disease stop him, who led 500 of Christianity's finest warriors into impossible battle and emerged victorious, has moved you, then subscribe to Unfinished Battles right now, hit that like button, and comment telling me which country you're watching from and which stories of courage overcoming adversity resonate with your nation's history. Every culture has heroes who refuse to let circumstances define them. At Montgisard, 500 healthy elite warriors followed a dying 16-year-old leper king against 26,000 enemies. In 3 hours, they destroyed an empire's army. The legend says they were sick. The truth is better. They were professionals inspired by a boy who proved that courage has nothing to do with physical strength. Baldwin IV never surrendered to his disease, and that refusal changed history.